Hello again, my friends, and welcome to another episode of Between the Lines of Scripture. I'm your host, Dennis Cole, and today we're going to explore some lesser known or often missed facts and details about Noah and the Great Flood, mostly from Genesis and later Jewish, Christian, and comparative traditions. Now, Noah was not necessarily perfect in the modern sense. Genesis calls Noah righteous and blameless in his generation, and that phrase has sparked debate for centuries. Some interpreters read it as high praise. Noah was righteous despite it of living in a corrupt age, and others read in his generation as a qualifier. Compared with everyone around him, Noah looked righteous, but he may not have reached the moral levels of figures like Abraham. So, in other words, Noah is portrayed as faithful, but not always as an ideal hero. Now, the Hebrew word used for Noah's Ark is teva, Tevah, which means something closer to a box, a chest, or a container than a normal seagoing vessel. Interestingly, the same Hebrew word is used for the basket that carried baby Moses on the Nile. So, in both stories, a teva preserves life through dangerous waters. Now, here's something interesting. Noah is never recorded speaking before the flood. In Genesis, Noah receives commands. He builds the ark and enters it and survives. But before the flood, he does not speak a single recorded word. This is one reason later interpreters sometimes contrast Noah with Abraham. Abraham argues with God over Sodom. Noah, at least in the biblical text, does not argue for his generation. Now, the flood story has a very structured timeline. The flood is not described as a single vague catastrophe. Genesis gives a surprisingly detailed chronology. The rain begins, and it rains for 40 days and 40 nights. The waters prevail on the face of the earth for 150 days. Afterwards, the ark comes to rest on the mountains of Ararat. The waters recede gradually over months, and then Noah exits more than a year after entering the ark. So, although people often remember only the 40 days and 40 nights, the whole flood episode lasts over a year in the narrative. Now, Ararat is probably a region, not just one mountain. Genesis says the ark rested on the mountains of Ararat, not specifically Mount Ararat as a single peak. That likely refers to a broader region associated with ancient Urartu, roughly in the Armenian highlands. The familiar idea of the ark landing on one particular mountain developed later. The raven and the dove behave very differently. Noah first sends out a raven and then a dove. The raven goes to and fro until the waters dry up. Ravens are carrion birds and could survive in a devastating landscape. The dove, by contrast, returns because it needs a suitable place to land and feed. When it later brings back an olive leaf, it signals that habitable life is returning. The two birds function almost like two different tests of a post flood world. The olive leaf is not necessarily from a full grown tree. The dove brings back a freshly plucked olive leaf. That detail matters because it suggests regrowth or survival of vegetation after the waters recede. Some interpreters point out that olive trees are hardy and branches can sometimes survive harsh conditions. The text does not require imagining a fully restored forest springing up overnight. After Noah exits the ark, he builds an altar and offers sacrifices. This is the first explicit altar building scene in the Bible. It also creates a major transition. After the flood, God makes a covenant promising not to destroy all life by flood again. The rainbow is called a bow, like a warrior's bow. The Hebrew word for rainbow is the same word used for a bow as a weapon. That gives the covenant sign a symbolic layer. God's bow is placed in the clouds, no longer aimed at the earth. It is a sign of restraint and mercy after judgment. Now, the animals were not simply two of every kind. Many people remember the story as two of every animal, but Genesis also says Noah took 7 pairs of clean animals and birds and 1 pair of unclean animals. Well, this is important because after the flood, Noah sacrifices some clean animals. If he had only taken one pair of each, the sacrifice would wipe out those species immediately. Although we could assume that during the year on the ark, animals would have mated and produced offspring. Now, the flood story has two repeated themes: corruption and violence. Genesis did not describe the pre flood world merely as immoral in a vague way, it repeatedly emphasizes violence and corruption. The Hebrew word, often translated violence, is Hamas, not connected in meaning to the modern political group, but a common biblical word for wrongdoing, oppression, or violence. Now, after the flood, Noah becomes a farmer, and then things get kind of messy. After the flood, Noah plants a vineyard. He drinks some wine, becomes drunk, and lies uncovered in his tent. This strange episode leads to the troubling story involving Ham, Canaan, and Noah's curse. It is a reminder that the flood does not magically remove human brokenness. The new world after the flood still contains shame, family conflict, and moral ambiguity. The covenant after the flood is not just with Noah, it is with Noah, his descendants, and every living creature. That makes it one of the Bible's most universal covenants. It includes humanity and animals. The Noahide laws come from later Jewish interpretation. Jewish tradition developed the idea of seven Noahide laws, basic moral laws thought to apply to all humanity, not only to Israel. They include prohibitions against idolatry, murder, theft, sexual immorality, blasphemy, and eating flesh torn from a living animal, plus the requirement to establish courts of justice. These are later rabbinic developments, not listed as a neat set in Genesis itself. Now, the flood story has ancient Near Eastern parallels. The story of the Great Flood is not unique to Genesis. The flood story has ancient Near Eastern parallels. You see, the story of the Great Flood is not unique to Genesis. Ancient Mesopotamian texts also tell flood stories, including the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Atrahasis epic. Those stories include themes like divine judgment, a chosen survivor, a large boat, animals preserved, birds sent out, and sacrifice after the flood. The biblical version is distinctive, though, in its moral framing. The flood is tied to human violence and corruption rather than, for example, humans being too noisy for the gods. And we find that Noah's name is connected to rest or comfort. Genesis links Noah's name with the hope that he will bring comfort from the painful toil of the ground cursed after Adam's sin. The nameplay is not exact in a modern linguistic sense, but the story presents Noah as connected to relief, rest, and a new beginning. Genesis says the ark had lower, second, and third decks. It also had rooms or compartments, which suggest a carefully ordered structure rather than a simple open barge. The design is practical in narrative terms. It preserves different kinds of life in an organized way. And the flood itself reverses creation imagery. Genesis 1 describes God bringing order by separating waters and making dry land appear. In the flood story, those boundaries collapse. Water from above and below overwhelm the ordered world. Then, as the waters recede and dry land appears again, the story resembles a kind of recreation. Now, Noah's personal story ends quietly and soberly. Noah lives 950 years, but after the vineyard episode, he fades from the narrative. Unlike Abraham, Moses, or David, he has no long speeches, no extended prayers, and no dramatic later mission. His story is monumental, but his character remains surprisingly quiet and mysterious. I'm Dennis Cole, and thank you for joining me today on Between the Lines of Scripture. I hope you enjoyed this little expose on Noah and the ark. And may God bless you in all that you do, and we'll see you next time.